you for joining us for Ipsos's webinar exploring Canadian food service trends and opportunities. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. I also want to encourage you to check out the handouts we've uploaded into the webinar control panel. Today's webinar is being recorded and will also be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Asad Amin, Senior Vice President and Head of Syndicated Solutions. Asad, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to our annual update on the Canadian food service trends outlook. The theme of the VANTAGE 2024 report is the Culinary Kaleidoscope. I think the first thing we want to talk about is the changing face of our country. It's growing. I think that's a hard fact. We see around over 40 million Canadians in our population currently. That's gone up from 36 million in just about 8 years. And we're going to get the same amount of growth in half that time. So it's a sheer opportunity in terms of if you're looking for areas of growth, of areas of penetration, the size of the prize continues to grow. But the important thing is that it continues to evolve as well. And the needs and the behaviors and values of where we are going to end up is going to be important for us to understand. I think one aspect also that's fairly seismic as part of this change is that millennials have overtaken boomers as the largest base of the population. And this passing of the baton is another anomaly in terms of how things are going to change, of what's important and a priority on especially how people eat and drink. And finally, we can't ignore the importance of the multicultural face and the opportunity and growing needs of newcomers coming into our country. And all of this ties into other factors, macro forces that we've been seeing for some time, that around inflationary pressures, climate change, all of these have some level of an impact on our population at large. And that's kind of where we've come to our theme of the kaleidoscope. And I feel that the patterns that we're going to see as an evolution of these population shifts are going to impact overall consumption and obviously the food service industry in particular. Now, there's a multitude of ways all of these factors continue to drive change in behavior, whether it's channel shifts, competitive landscape, what people choose to eat and drink. In the span of about 45 minutes, there's only so much we're going to cover. So what we've tried to do is focus on 4 key trends that you need to make sure that you understand that in some ways influence all of these behavior changes that we're seeing. The first is the element that we are going to focus on the most. And there's actually probably the vast majority of today that's going to be focused on the theme of newcomers. And it's an important element of the changes, which we'll speak to just in terms of their sheer size alone. The second thing is around digital dining. And we've been talking about this for many years now, but I think it's still an important area of growth, but also how this continues to evolve and some of the shifts we're seeing in some ways slowing down for that utility, particularly among specific channels. Now, chains and independents are also one of those points where people have been asking us, and a lot of our clients have been curious in terms of how this dynamic has shifted, especially post-pandemic. So we'll take a look exactly how things have played out, and it may not be what you've been expecting. And finally, the trends around environmental, social, and governance. It continues to be a more evident and important topic. Just look at how things are changing for the climate, look at how things are changing in terms of how we define what we value. I think it's an important component to understand where food service sector and your brands play in this area overall as well. Now, I said this before, whatever we share isn't made out of conjecture. It's based on hard facts. The most of our data is sourced from our food service monitor, but we have a slew of different products in our arsenal that we use and have been covering for over a decade. The 5 study looks at total overall consumption. There's also trends that we are seeing in moderation habits in the alcohol study, which gives us, again, that perspective and strength in the trends that we highlight. But again, the global trends and studies that we have also add a little bit of color, especially in context of how Canadians are feeling relative to the rest of the world. Now, before I get into each of the trends, I think it's really important for you to understand what is the current state of the Canadian food service industry. Just quickly, in terms of the setting of where we're in, I think the first thing which hasn't changed for the last at least year and a half is that traffic continues to lag sales. Sales compared to last year and even compared to pre-pandemic continues to grow at double digits. And again, we know this is because of higher menu prices. Traffic, on the other hand, at least on the surface, looks like it's finally improving. There is at least positive momentum. However, if you break that into the surface or below the surface, you can see the QSR sector, while it's up compared to a year ago, we're still not where we were compared to before the pandemic. It's actually relatively flat. And full service is actually softer. It has made some gains, but it's actually behind where we were pre-pandemic. It had a really good run through most of last year, but towards the end, it had slowed down, and we'll get into that as well. The retail and other channel, and this is primarily your home meal replacement, your convenience and gas channels, they're actually going at leaps and bounds. One is that there's a lot more traffic within those channels where there was some level of pause. Lunch has improved, which we'll speak to later on as well. But just in terms of the foot traffic, in terms of who goes there, we're talking about newcomers. We know that they're overdeveloped in that channel. Your convenience and gas channels have continued to play more and more in this area. And then you take the entire value equation with inflationary pressure, there's a reason why we're seeing that level of growth in that particular channel. It is smaller than the rest, but that is one of the explanations for the differences in growth. Now, if we look at our trend line for traffic and sales, for sales in particular, for both full service and QSR, you can see the ups and downs from the pandemic. And I've shown this many times already. What we're seeing as of the end of last year is that, again, that run we had through most of summer kind of dissipated towards the end. And we know even with our latest March numbers that there is some level of improvement, but it's still not back to where we would expect. And you can see with full service, that's finally taken a better footing, but it is at equal levels with QSR. And historically, there was always some level of a gap between the two. So full service in particular continues to struggle, as you can see with the traffic growth numbers. The main reason for this is the changes that we've seen on channels. And dine-in has really not come back to where we expect. And I think these channel shifts are explaining a lot of the differences we're seeing in traffic overall. Takeout accounts for close to half of all traffic, and it stayed there even compared to how things have changed post-pandemic. Dine-in, on the other hand, really dropped to around 1 in 4 occasions, but now it's hovered around 29%. Still around close to a 10-point difference compared to where we were pre-pandemic. I think these changes are very telling in terms of how consumers are dining, where they're choosing to go, and again, what's driving overall traffic. Drive-through also seems to be holding steady. It had pulled back, but because things have started to move back in terms of people going back into work and morning traffic going up, I think it's gained a little bit of that momentum. And delivery, on the other hand, is back to where it was prior to the pandemic. It had a really strong run through most of the last 5 years, but there has definitely been a pullback in overall traffic numbers for delivery. Now, a bit of good news that we see is that because people are starting to move back into the office, we see about a third of people indicating as a whole that they are actually working at their offices. And this is more or less the same level it was just after the pandemic in terms of people working from home. That has a huge amount of impact on one particular day part, and that's at lunch. and we're seeing visible changes in traffic as a result. Lunch, finally, after long last, has shown signs of improvement in overall traffic. We're not completely back to where we would expect, but it's a huge flush of fresh air for a lot of people, a lot of operators in urban centers. Breakfast, on the other hand, because it was the first one off the bat to improve, has remained relatively flat. We're not seeing that much of a change, and dinner is where most of the focus was. And it continues still to be a fairly large day part, but because of a lot of the gains and the other day parts, we're seeing some level of softness. And again, that explains why delivery has kind of trickled down. That's usually where their bread and butter is primarily. And this one element is fairly positive in terms of those changes. However, there is still a gray cloud looming among many diners, and that is about the cost and price of pretty much everything we spend on. So I think just briefly, we've touched upon this to a large degree last year. I've spoken about it recently at the Restaurants Canada show. I'm not going to get into too much depth, but it is important for you to understand where consumers sit on the entire price value equation. So contextually, historically, inflation hovered around 1.6%. And what we've seen that it peaked around 2022 a while ago at 8.1%. And it's actually gone back down, and it's stayed fairly stable for a while now. It's still higher than those historical lows, which were pretty abnormal. But consumers still haven't changed their behaviors. In particular for food service, I think there's an important component for you to understand of how inflation has impacted our sector of the industry in particular. So if we look at the March numbers, overall prices are up by 2.9%. For retail, it's actually up around 1.9%. So things have pulled back in terms of grocery prices, even though they are still high. There is actually a large-scale improvement in those prices. However, for the food service sector, it's actually more than double than what we see at retail. And not just that, it's actually the third highest contributor to overall inflation after mortgage and other interests. So it's a pretty big impact on our sector in terms of the high prices, and it's something that I think we can't ignore. And when we look at how consumers in general are feeling about interest rates and inflation, what we know that it's grown as of when the prices really started to rise and have peaked, but it hasn't pulled back. And that's again the point about overall, when we look at the most important issues facing Canadians, inflation is pretty much at the same level or close to housing and healthcare, and has not gone back down. More importantly, when we look at the food service sector, we know that the average eater check has gone up from just about around below $9 to close to around 13 or 12. What we see is on a lot of consumer sentiment questions on diners that has really told a telling picture as of recent months. So when we ask if diners are going to reduce their dine-in if restaurant prices are higher, that's remained fairly stable, but it started to trickle up slightly higher in the last couple of months to the end of last year. And when we look at the notion of nothing is going to stop me from eating out at restaurants, that actually took a pretty big drop around the middle of last year and through summer. And in contrast, when we look at wanting to save money and economic future is uncertain, that's actually gone in the opposite way. So when we look at our consumer sentiment questions about food service diners, you can see that it is really top of mind on higher prices are having on their overall behavior. Now, those are facts. Those are things we can go around. We continue to talk about in our latest report what you can do to address them, from promotions and value play and deals and everything of that nature. But I think what we want to do is really focus on there are still a lot of areas of growth and positive momentum we can get to. And as things started to trickle back to normal, and we've seen inflation levels go down, you need to understand how you want to get yourself ready for those areas of growth. And that's why this first trend around the culinary mosaic is really important for us to spend some time on. So we've broken our cohorts in a couple of ways based on how long they've been in the country, but also ethnicity. So if we look at people or Canadians that have been in the country for 4+ years, or if they were born here, overall traffic compared to 2019 is pretty flat. It's around -1%. Now, when we looked at our information and we looked at newcomers to the country, those that have only arrived here in the last 3 years, the growth rate is a whopping 132%. Now, this is over the course of the last 5 years, but it's reflective of the number of new people coming into the country, and they are going out to eat. And that's why it's important for us to understand is what is the opportunity here as this continues to trickle forward. Now, food service and immigrants have had a symbiotic relationship throughout. We know that 1 in 4 workers in the food service sector are immigrants, and there's 3,200 recent immigrants that actually owned a food and beverage business. I think it's also important to understand the history behind food service and people coming into our country. We take 3 examples. All are powerhouse, in some cases brand names within the industry for sure, but even in terms of media personalities. Vikram Vij on the far left, owner of Vij's and various other establishments in BC, is pretty much a household name there. Susur Lee, also a powerhouse in the Toronto food scene. Lee's, his flagship restaurant, recently reopened. So if you're looking for his Singapore slaw, it's available finally. And Mohammed Faki, who owns the Paramount Empire, which is a Middle Eastern chain that started in Mississauga and is pretty much available in various other corners, and also has influenced a lot of growth for a lot of other franchises and chains. All were new to the country. They were not born here, but they've established themselves, and they were pioneers in the sector in terms of the growth that they've developed. Similarly, chains that we've seen open are also interesting in terms of the international influence a lot of brands have had. So starting with Jollibee, it's a fried chicken franchise, but originates in the Philippines. In fact, their first store they opened was in Winnipeg because of the highest concentration of Filipinos in the country. I was guilty at lining up in Scarborough when they kind of first opened as well. Those lineups remained for a really long time too. Paris Baguette is not a chain out of France. It's actually out of Seoul, Korea. And they have an ambition of opening at least another 100 stores by 2030. Percentage Arabica is a specialty coffee chain out of Japan, really strong footprint and a lot of big locations with high traffic within Toronto currently. Bing's is a crispy hamburger chain hailing from mainland China, and their buns versus their fillings are pretty unique. Again, in really strong locations with high traffic. And Chaiwala actually serves South Asian tea as well as cuisine. And while the roots are in South Asia, its origins are actually from the UK. I think the main point here is it's kind of in some ways coincidence that I picked these because all of them are reflecting some level of fusion cuisine. At the same time, they're reflecting of the diaspora, like where their journey is, where they've come from, and the demand there is from people that are, one, new to the country, but at the same time, people that are also familiar and willing to try new things and are looking for a new set of options that I think everyone needs to be mindful of. And even within our data, we see the 3 fastest growing new cuisines are all originating from 3 different areas of the world. Ramen, hailing from Japan, shawarma from the Middle East, and karahi from South Asia. All are growing at a fairly rapid pace in our information for the last couple of years. Another thing we need to understand and step back on is how did the demographics kind of evolve within newcomers to the country? So in 1981, you can see the vast majority of people new to the country were primarily from Great Britain, Europe, and the United States. And you look at the most recent year, more than half are coming from Asia, as well as from Africa. So that obviously has a big shift in terms of where people are coming from, their values, and what they're looking for. But more importantly, just in terms of their size, they account for 1 in 4 Canadians. That's the size of Quebec, and that is why they're important. We're talking about a $2.6 billion opportunity right now, and it's continuing to grow. So if we're looking for pockets of growth, that's why, again, it's important to understand who these individuals are. The challenge, obviously, for marketers is like, where do you start? Who do you talk to? I mean, if you talk about any type of multicultural campaign, you'd think it's homogenous the way a lot of discussions are made, but they aren't. You know, there's differences by ethnicity, gender, by religion, sexual orientation, you name it. That is the challenge. So you need to understand the diversity behind the diversity, but there has to be a pragmatic aspect of how you approach the multicultural sector. And I think what you need to understand are what are the traits that are similar among most of them. And the most common traits that we've identified is, first of all, they're young. You know, most of the people that are coming into the country are fitting within Gen Z and millennials. There are also families that are coming in. There are larger household sizes. They settle in strong urban centers, primarily within Toronto and Vancouver. And they are overdeveloped in terms of their education levels. And that's, once they do settle in, we do visibly see higher income earners among that group. So all of these things give you some level of nuance in terms of who you need to target as a whole, if that is the approach that we need to take. And more importantly, I think if you're seeing them fall within a certain group, they are going to be reflective of that generation, as opposed to necessarily everything that they are bringing to the table from their roots and their origins. I think you have to be mindful of those nuances, but it's really you're talking to a younger generation of people when you're talking to these individuals. Now, even in terms of this current climate, although we're seeing growth in traffic, it could be even higher, because we know, again, through those consumer sentiment questions, that among those that are tenured, i.e. those that are either born here for 4+ years, and again, we break it down by ethnicity, those that are from multicultural origins are more likely to say that they don't have any concerns, and more likely to say that they wanted to save money. And again, that's especially true for newcomers as well. But what's interesting is that 64% of newcomers said that they would dine out if towards restaurants if they had a little extra money. That actually falls just behind going out to cinemas in terms of how important it is as a hobby and a pastime, and more on that in terms of why that is. I think while we are waiting for some level of growth and direction and a huge seismic return towards food service, new Canadians and established ones alike continue to develop their palates. And we're seeing that in terms of how they're cooking at home. When we look at different types of multicultural dishes, the preparation at home is actually driven by those that have been established, particularly from white cohorts. And in terms of North American dishes, whether you're talking about pasta and so on, it's actually more higher among multicultural Canadians in terms of the usage. So that again speaks to the availability of a broader target, especially when you're talking about new types of cuisines, because it's an open palette for everyone. People are bringing their foods to the country, but then there's those that are established that are always willing to try new things. And I think the key takeaway here is that the growth is coming from younger people on both sides of the equation. It's whether it's white millennials and leading Gen Z, or it's multicultural millennials and leading Gen Z. They're the ones that are trying out each other's cuisine the most, and again, are most open to it. I think that's most telling, because when you kind of dig below the surface in terms of some of the most developed states for food service occasions, what we see is that what multicultural Canadians, newcomers, Gen Z, and millennials look for, this is overall, it's not just for newcomers have very similar traits to younger cohorts. You see things around mental uplift, emotional traits, experience, connection, trying new things, and health and wellness drivers. All of these are overdeveloped among multicultural newcomers and among Gen Z and trailing millennials. And again, that's why I think these things are important to tie together and with each other. And even if we were to double click into some of these need states, just to think of various strategies we can approach towards newcomers, when we look at those mental uplift occasions, they're looking to de-stress. They're younger, there's higher levels of pressure on their disposable income. They've left their country, they're coming to a new place. I think there's always an emotional uplift if you're going to satisfy some level of a craving. Same thing with the exploration. And I think the first point there is the most important, which is a level of authenticity. You have to take, especially among young cohorts, and especially if people with certain palates are bringing that to the country, what can you offer to them that is unique for them? And at the same time, they're open to trying new things. They're open to explore. And finally, the needs around social confidence. I think what you want to do is cater to, one, the ability to help them fit in, whether they're going out with coworkers or newfound friends, or at the same time being connected or belonging to this newfounded community. I think those nuances within what drives people, especially newcomers to food service, are important to understand. So in closing for this section, I think the important thing about reaching multicultural consumers is that you don't have to have a jack of all trades and a really complex approach. I think the main nuance is you've got to have something more singular. And I think it's more the outlook that, multicultural isn't the market, but the market is multicultural, especially when you're talking about younger cohorts. There is a blending of the preferences, the needs, and what the most important things they seek. So that kind of makes it that much easier. And if you think of it that way, of course, you have to be careful and mindful of some of the nuances, and you can get more tactical depending on where you want to target and grow. But I think that would be one of the more bigger takeaways overall for that cohort. So as I said, most of our focus would have been on newcomers, but we want to talk about 3 additional trends and just touch on them in terms of what we've seen growing. So as I mentioned, digitized dining continues to grow. In fact, it's up around 85% compared to last year. Now, it's still seismic, but it started to slow down. It used to be triple digit about a year ago. And even in terms of size, it's massive. It's around $10.8 billion, and it was only around half that 5 years ago. But we are seeing some slowdown depending on the channel and depending on where they're focused on. So the first thing I want to speak to is a comparison on traffic between dine-in and delivery. Now, this isn't to scale. I've purposely moved them close together because since the beginning of the pandemic, I've just been curious to see the correlation between dine-in and delivery. And we've seen a pretty close negative correlation between, as people started to dine in, delivery started to go up. And now the dine-in is returning back to its normalcy, albeit still less than where it was prior to the pandemic. We see some slow levels of creeping up or creeping down, for delivery. It's still higher than where it was prior to the pandemic, but it's certainly taken the wind off the sails for the trajectory it's had. And of course, I think a lot of the pressures that we're seeing around inflation has a massive amount of pressure to play in it. Now, the adoption rates have been higher. We have become habitual to it. I think it's a matter of what can it offer to really help stand out. But the point around technology isn't just tied to delivery and its channels. I think usage among younger cohorts is huge when it comes to their decisions around food and beverage. In fact, close to 1 in 3 use some type of technology to help them decide on whatever they eat and drink. And when we look at the top things that are driving this, everything from where they seek out recipes, where they kind of congregate and discuss, looking at how they kind of track their consumption behavior is higher than delivery apps themselves. So it's still a really important channel to, again, continue to drive traffic, continue to influence, and continue to try and have some level of communication directly with your guests as well. The third trend around chains versus independents, and as I mentioned, we've had a lot of clients asking in terms of what are the differences between these particular areas of growth overall in the market. As I said, the results might be somewhat surprising to hear. Now, overall, irrespective of QSR and FSR, we do see chains growing by around 9% versus prior to the pandemic. Independents, however, have started to soften. And a large reason for this is because of the ability for these smaller operations to be able to sustain throughout the pandemic, post-pandemic. Margins are small, prices continue to go high. Some of these establishments are like, well, it might not be worth for me to continue to pay these high rents as well. So that is the difficulty a lot of independents continue to face, even though there is a lot of growth. I think there is an opportunity there, but I think that's one of the main things to understand in terms of these differences. When we look at some of the key value drivers, now broken out by QSR chains, FSR chains, and independents, respectively, you can see some of the key differences in terms of where they're developed. QSR chains are actually underdeveloped in offering a slew of different value equations. QSR independents and FSR independents. Discounted price, menu item offers, all of these things are areas that they're kind of under supported and hard to compete with chains. And when you have all those additional pressures, the ability to continue to offer those values when consumers continue to seek them is going to be harder. Now, having said that, independents always had some strengths in terms of what they offer, and they continue to. People flock to independents to look for new things and to try new things. Taste those dynamics in terms of socialization, looking for premium and fresh things, some level of personalization and exploration are all things that independents offer. I think as things change, and if more and more of them continue to kind of shut down, there are going to be new ones that open up. And I think what you have to be mindful of is who is opening up. And if they do, how can you compete on these traits, especially if you are a chain operator, and ensure that you cater to these needs. Remember, these are things that not only young people kind of seek out, but also newcomers to the country. And that is one of the areas to play a role when you play your value card throughout. The third trend is around being green and fair, and that is around environmental, social, and governance. I think consumers are going to continue to demand multinationals to be able to contribute to some degree towards society. And I think this is reflected in a lot of the data that we see. 37% expect a lot of operators to protect the environment, whether it's around waste management, in terms of how you want to have a carbon footprint, your recycling practices, all of those things. 40% also ask to improve society overall. This looks at your diversity practices. This looks at fair trade practices in terms of where you're sourcing from, all of those things as well. I think it's an area that you can't ignore. I think it's an area, as we'll see, is important to certain levels of society. And you have to be really mindful of exactly where you can carve a niche for yourself here. Then coming back to how these have evolved when it comes to foods and beverages, there's three things you need to be mindful of. First of all, when we look at practices around the product, product quality, the freshness, where it's sourced from, this is the biggest component of kind of environmental, social, and governance practices when it comes to foods and beverages. But that's kind of softened. And what we see growing the most is around the environment. So everything from climate change, waste reduction, sustainability practices, these are the areas that continue to drive areas of growth within food and beverage consumption. Social practices are smaller and somewhat softer, less to be concerned about, but still overall important. But that environment practice is the sweet spot. And we've seen from our information that millennials and younger cohorts in general are willing to pay a premium for that luxury and the ability to invest in companies that are looking out for the environment overall. When we look at our conscious consumption factors, the important thing to be mindful of is that there are differences between what's really most important around product freshness and ingredients. You can see skews highest among boomers and older cohorts. Where we see things that are less important currently are really more developed among younger people. Everything from the environmental impact, sustainable packaging, fair treatment of workers, climate change, and so on. And the reason all of this is important is that that passing of the baton has taken place. And as younger people continue to grow, these values are really important for them. So you really need to be mindful of exactly how can you ensure that you have the right type of strategy to position your brand in this area overall. So with that, the main things I want to leave behind with you with the slew of information that we've shared are these 4 points. You know, with newcomers to the country, you can clearly see an element of growth. And I think the important thing here is that it's not as complicated as you might think. There isn't a way to look at and speak to the mainstream, but you really have to understand some of the cultural nuances. And again, ensure that whatever you can offer allows a clear benefit and relevance to the audience you're speaking to. It's going to continue to be a huge opportunity for a number of sectors, including food service. Digital dining continues to grow, but it continues to evolve. I think the main point here is that there's lots of ways to play, and you have to make sure you play in this area because it's an area of influence among those younger cohorts. At the same time, there is a level of cynicism that we've seen from a lot of our information, especially among younger people, on app usage, the information that's being shared, because of the level of misinformation that's out there. So I think those things you still have to be mindful of in terms of breaking through the clutter. The point around chains and independents is that there is a softness among independents because of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing, but there is a lot of value that they hold and a lot of authenticity that they kind of portray and exude. What can chains offer to ensure that they can kind of replicate some of those points or continue to try and provide further value so that trajectory and growth can be maintained? And finally, the points around environmental, social, and governance. It's a fairly broad topic. It's not an area that everyone can immediately automatically play and have credibility. I think that's the main point. It's something that's important for growing cohorts. It's a matter of where can you play and where can you do it in a credible manner. And I think that's one key area of differentiation relative to the rest of the competition. So a lot of information shared in a fairly short span of time. With that, if there are any questions, I'll pass things back to Ellen. Our report will be releasing this coming Monday. Again, I've just looked at the surface of information that we will be covering. So if there's any questions, please do let me know. Ellen, back to you.
Wow, Asad, that was quite a detailed presentation. Thanks so much. We do have a couple of questions coming in, but I think that in the interest of time, we're gonna get those questions to you and respond directly to our askers. In the meantime, do please check out the handouts we've uploaded into the control panel so that you can read more a little bit about the research we shared today. And please reach out to Asad directly. His email address is right here on the screen. A link to today's recorded presentation should be coming within the next couple of days. Well, that now concludes today's wonderful webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.